But anyway, Michel Paul Foucault, who was known as Paul Foucault when he was a kid, was born into the kind of family that Michael Kalecki describes as the kind of family in a position to influence intellectual and academic trends, and usually does. The intellectual and academic trends usually are set by people born into such families. His father was a physician and a medical school professor, although he had very little relationship with his father, and one way to interpret his persistent hostility to authority in general, and particularly medical authority, is to see it in the light of his what little we know about his relationship to his father and his mother, to whom he was very close. Toward the end of his life, he always spent August with his mother. His mother had inherited land, so it was his mother who was the major property owner in the family, and one of my theses is that he was loyal to his mother throughout his life. Kalecki would suggest that the funding of literary and academic life in France or anywhere else depends largely on decisions made by people like the Foucaults. So it is likely that trends in academic work will reflect the perceived interest in the ideals of the funders and the purchasers. At least we can, this is a hypothesis. It may not be true, but at least let's take the hypothesis that if we go through in detail and consider his career with all of its twists and turns and changes and reconsiderations and new departures, if we consider that in detail, let's ask ourselves the question, is it consistent with the hypothesis that he was always loyal to the interests of his family and of the background, the sort of background he came from? Maybe so, maybe not. We don't know until we look at maybe we'll never know. But what we can say is if we look at what he did from the beginning of his intellectual career to the end and find that it was consistent with this hypothesis, that will tend to confirm it, and if not, not. Now, on a first and superficial glance at what is sort of popularly known as the philosophy of Michel Foucault, which in fact doesn't exist, there was never any sort of coherent, consistent, and enduring philosophy of Foucault. But on a first and superficial glance, my sort of view and his sort of view are incompatible. If one is right, the other must be wrong. Foucault is against authority. I'm in favor of authority in the sense of moral authority. Foucault unabashedly favors devoting life to pleasure seeking, although he perhaps toward the end of his life changed his mind, at least to the extent of favoring the discipline of the self by the self. I'm in favor of social norms that limit and channel pleasure seeking. Foucault sides with the sophists. He says so. I side with Plato. He sides with Nietzsche. I side with religion and with the morality of the herd that Nietzsche so charmingly criticizes. Certainly, one thing one had to say in favor of Foucault and of Nietzsche is they were certainly charming. If there's some reason to be negative about Foucault, it's certainly not deny that he was one of the most charming men who ever lived. I believe there's an objective basis for ethics in physical reality. He believes that discourse defines its objects. I believe in truth. Foucault, it's sometimes said, does not believe in truth. I explain social reality in terms of rules. He explains it in terms of power. I have any number of proposals for solving humanity's main problems. Foucault has none. In fact, he specifically criticizes it in sort of a major phase of his career, the general intellectual who proposes grand solutions to grand problems. And even his activism on prison issues was not framed as a proposal for solving the prison problem. It was framed as giving voice to the prisoners to tell their stories in their own words. He says he offers no solutions in various texts, which in the written version of this I'll put in footnotes for. Now, on a closer examination, these differences which appear on a first and superficial glance tend to vanish. I agree with Foucault more than would appear from my self-portrayal that I've just given. His claims on the whole turn out to be rather modest and limited, although not uninteresting or unimportant. He did believe in truth, even though he has a certain reputation for not believing in it. His writings are often not so much extreme as ambiguous, lending themselves to multiple and sometimes mutually incompatible interpretations. Certainly, this is neither the first nor the last time that scholars will categorize Foucault as an extreme leftist, as an extreme rightist. He's been categorized in almost every category, and there must be a reason for this. The high degree of ambiguity and fluidity of his writings and their capacity for lending themselves to different interpretations. Jana Sawicki wrote about Foucault that he has been labeled a structuralist determinist and a voluntarist, as an activist and a fatalist, as a leftist and as a neoconservative, suggests either that his own discourse was incoherent and confused, or that his interpreters have been unwilling to suspend assumptions and categories when judging it. Okay, let's try. Let's try to suspend assumptions. Let's try to suspend categories, and let's try to look at what he said. Well, more or less in the order in which he said it, but at the beginning I'm going to make a few concessions by letting Foucault introduce himself by taking one of the times when he himself made a short description of his own work. In 1983, when Foucault was on a visit to Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, before he rather suddenly and unexpectedly died, leaving a great deal of work in progress uncompleted, Foucault wrote a brief description of his philosophy in English, which included the following words. I'm quoting Foucault now. As a starting point, let us take a series of oppositions which have developed over the last few years. Oppositions to the power of men over women, oppositions to the power of parents over children, opposition to the power of psychiatry over the mentally ill, of medicine over the population, of administration over the way people live. Now, it's not enough to say, I'm still quoting Foucault, it's not enough to say that these are anti-authority struggles. We must try to define more precisely what they have in common. First, they are transversal struggles. That is, they're not limited to one country. Of course, they develop more easily and to a greater extent in some countries than others. But they're not confined to a particular political or economic form of government. They occur under all political and economic forms. I'm still quoting Foucault. Secondly, the aim of these struggles is power effects as such. For example, the medical profession is not criticized primarily because it is a profit-making concern, but because it exercises an uncontrolled power over people's bodies, their health, and their life and death. And third, these are immediate struggles for two reasons. In such struggles, people criticize instances of power which are closest to them, those which exercise their action on individuals. They do not look for the chief enemy. Foucault puts the phrase the chief enemy in scare quotes. They're looking for an immediate enemy. Nor do they expect to find a solution to their problems at a future date. That is, liberations or revolutions or the end of the class struggle. In comparison with the theoretical scale of explanations or revolutionary order which polarizes the historian, they are anarchistic struggles. Close quote from Foucault, University of California at Berkeley, 1983, introducing himself briefly. Now I'll read my own words. Now, each of these three commonalities of the new struggles, which are defined in Foucault's proposed, what he calls a starting point, is consistent with what Foucault told Catherine von Bülow at the funeral of Jean-Paul Sartre, when he said that his youthful passion, this is Foucault's youthful passion, had been to separate himself from the terrorism of Sartre and Sartre's journal, Les Temps Modernes. He's building an alternative to phenomenological Marxism, he says, remarking to von Bülow at Sartre's funeral. Now, in each of the three cases, the anarchistic struggle that Foucault endorses is contrasted with notions typical of Marxism, namely, concerned with a particular political or economic form of government. You know, that's what Marxists do. They want to have a different political or economic form of government. Foucault says, no, these are struggles with any form of government, these anarchistic struggles against the power of medicine over the body, of men over women, of parents over children. Now, having identified, another thing that Marxists do is they criticize profit making, and they propose some revolution or liberation and an end of the class struggle. So, having identified these three commonalities of new struggles, Foucault goes on to say three more things about them, which he calls more specific. So now I'm going to quote Foucault again, describing himself. Foucault says, these are struggles in which they question the status of the individual. On the one hand, they assert the right to be different, and they underline everything which makes individuals truly individual. I'm quoting Foucault. On the other hand, they attack everything which separates the individual, breaks his links with others, splits up community life, forces the individual back on himself, and ties him to his own identity in a constraining way. These struggles are not exactly for or against the individual, but rather they are struggles against the government of individualization. Should we stop? Well, okay. 5, I'm still quoting Foucault. They are in opposition to the effects of power which are linked with knowledge, competence, and qualification. They're struggles against the privileges of knowledge, but they are also in opposition against secrecy, deformation, and mystifying representations imposed on people. Still quoting Foucault. There's nothing scientific in this, that is, there's no dogmatic belief in the value of scientific knowledge, but neither is it a skeptical or relativistic refusal of all verified truth. So Foucault wasn't really against all truth. He sometimes has a reputation of being someone who deconstructed truth, so now we only believe in power, we don't believe in truth anymore. But Foucault says, no, that's not actually what he says. What is questioned is the way in which knowledge circulates and functions. In short, the regime de savoir. He lapsed back into French because he couldn't figure out a way to say regime de savoir in English. But if you try to translate it, it means sort of government by knowledge. So knowledge is a form of power and government. And 6, still quoting Foucault. Finally, all these present struggles revolve around the question, who are we? They are a refusal of abstractions, of economic and ideological state violence which ignore who we are individually, and also a refusal of scientific or administrative inquisition which determines who one is. End of quote from Foucault. Now, earlier in the same text, the Berkeley text of 1983, Foucault states that his own goal during the last 20 years, in other words, this is the period 1963-1984, has been, I'd like to say first of all, what has been the goal of my work during the last 20 years. Here we have a shocker for the sort of standard view of Foucault. It has not been to analyze the phenomena of power. We've got to take this with a grain of salt, because this is 1983, right? And if you had asked him the same question in 1976, I, for one, say he would have said he was talking about the phenomenon of power. But now, as he often does, in 1983, he reinterprets his own prior work. He says, well, why was I interested in power? Well, no, not for power himself. Let me go on quoting Foucault. My objective had been to create a history of different modes by which in our culture human beings are made subjects. So now in 1983, he's saying all of this concern with power was really for a different objective. He wanted to see how we're made into subjects in our particular culture, and power came into that, but not as the main focus, but as a way of getting at the question of construction of the subject. Now, now he then goes on to identify sort of three ways in which human beings are made subjects. He calls them modes. The first of these is science, or modes of inquiry which pretend to be scientific. And the second is dividing practices. That is, dividing, for example, the sick and the healthy, the criminals and the good people. That is, all of the dividing practices are modes of constructing subjects. You know, who we are, well, we're the good people, they're the criminals. We're the healthy, they're the sick. Or maybe we're the sick, they're the healthy. And the other, the first, as I mentioned, was science, or science which pretends to tell us who we are. Now the third, finally I thought to study, and this is his current work, the way a human being turns himself into a subject. So this was at the very end of his life, from about 1981 to his death in 1985, he was fascinated by the question of how we self-define ourselves, how we create ourselves as subjects. And I've chosen, he said, the domain of sexuality. How men have learned to recognize themselves as subjects of sexuality. And before, just as what he was working on at the point of his unfortunate early death was a history of sexuality, which was going to carry the topic out. The first couple of volumes he published, but the first couple of volumes don't really have that much to say about sexuality, although they have a great deal to say about how people construct themselves as subjects. Okay, now I'm not quoting Foucault anymore. Now let me follow up these quotations in which Foucault introduces himself with some general remarks concerning three worries, or three sets of worries that people might have about Foucault. These are worries one might have. Later I'll tell about worries I do have. Now, since Foucault supported several worthy and important causes, one might worry that his influence would divert energy away from other equally or more worthy and important causes that are less identified with his name. For example, he was a big activist on the topic of prison reform, at least in the sense of giving voice to the prisoners, and certainly very strong on questions of reform of the mental health system. And he sometimes assigned part of the blame for the rise of a divisive identity politics that put movements to transform capitalism on the back burner. His friend, Gilles Deleuze, I say his friend because for most of their lives they were very close friends. However, they had a parting of the ways a few years before Foucault's death. According to Gilles Deleuze, Foucault undermined all leftism by making normalization, rather than some typically Marxist theme like oppression or exploitation, the center of historical analysis. One might worry that Foucault's influence has undermined and continues to undermine social movements that think of themselves as resisting oppression or exploitation. This is sort of a common critique of Foucault. I'm not that worried about this particular one. My view is that it's unlikely that transforming capitalism, ecology, and other important issues that Foucault didn't have that much to say about will be neglected because some people emphasize queer rights, prison justice, and other topics that were Foucault's special concerns. I see no logical reason why this should be so. However, this does not mean I'm not worried about Foucault. It's for one thing for one person to work on poverty issues, another person to work on prison issues. One person to work on unemployment, another person to work on the rights of people who have a different type of sexual identity. And it's one thing to say that, well, both of these people, the one who chooses one issue and the one who chooses another, have a comprehensive sense of how the system works and how to change it, and we've chosen to work in different vineyards and sort of to complement one another by working on different sorts of issues. But it's quite another thing for Foucault to go out of his way to construct a non-economic interpretation of history that filters out the economic structures that need to be changed. Now, Barry Smart has written that the political effect of Foucault's philosophy is, in summary, to render problematic the classic discourse of socialism and its associated forms of political strategy. Some may say this is all to the good. It may be all to the good even if one is a socialist and thinks socialists need to do things a different way. Although Smart does not explicitly consider the possibility that this political effect was one Foucault intended, consciously or unconsciously, I believe that the following chapters or the following discussions will convince an open-minded reader that this possibility is a probability. Now, having chosen, like John Dewey, to identify with the positive, liberal, and undogmatic sense of the historically battered term socialism, with full awareness of the crimes committed in its name, with an intention to eliminate all those ideas historically associated with the term that have lent themselves to committing those crimes, and with no intention of eliminating either markets or privately owned business, with the proposal of pluralism and transformation by enlargement rather than transformation by negation. I tend to identify with achieving desirable forms of socialism, and by a desirable form of socialism I mean one that does not exclude capitalism in a proper dosage and with proper governability. If I think of that as sort of a way to move toward solving humanity's principal problems, so to get from here, which some of us tend to see as a world of exchange value made, to there, that is a world where people evaluate and revise the institutions continually, so little by little the institutions do a better job of serving their functions. I think we need a theory, or we need theories, not just one but several. And by what I mean by theory is an account of causes and effects. We need to have some sense that if we're doing something for a reason, we have a good reason for believing that our actions will produce the effect intended. And this means we have to have some notions of cause and effect, how cause and effect or creativity work themselves out in the social realm. So I think I have good reasons for worrying about Foucault insofar as his work tends to discredit theory, tends to discredit any effort to identify causes and effects in social life. Now, one might also worry that Foucault's aversion to authority would make him antisocial. However, toward the end of his career, Foucault came to speak of a crisis of governability, which is quite similar to what Hannah Arendt talks about when she talks about a crisis of authority. Now, I believe Foucault would agree that in the real world, the breakdown of reasonable, functional, legitimate, non-authoritarian authority does not lead to the full freedom of the individual to pursue unusual pleasures. It leads instead to chaos, quickly followed by brutal authoritarian domination. I must admit that my thinking here is influenced by my experience in Chile during the Pinochet coup and its aftermath. So Foucault was sympathetic not only to the anti-authoritarian movements of the 1960s, but also to that period's experiments in communal life and worker ownership. He opposed everything which separates the individual, breaks his links with others, splits up community life, I'm repeating the quote from Foucault, and forces the individual back on himself and ties him to his own identity in a constraining way. So in general, I'm not worried about anti-authoritarian passions overwhelming an ethic of solidarity. One of my reasons for optimism is empirical. Findings of studies in the psychology of moral development show that the people committed to cooperating under the guidance of norms of solidarity tend to be the same people who respect other people's right to be different. As you might say that in the abstract, we have to choose. We either have solidarity, and then we have dull uniformity, or we have respect for individual differences, and then we can't cooperate because we're all so different, we don't cooperate. That might be a problem in the real world. However, when the psychologists study the way people actually behave, it turns out the good news is the contrary. The people who are most eager to cooperate with others to solve problems are the same ones who are most eager to respect the rights of other people to be different and to think different ways. So being anti-authoritarian appears to make people less antisocial and not more antisocial. Now, a third set of worries one might have concerns Foucault's relationship with Marxism. Sometimes he associated himself with Marx. You can read any number of quotes from Foucault where he sort of identifies as someone in the tradition of Marx. But sometimes he distanced himself from Marx. You can find even more quotes from Foucault where he distances himself from Marx. So one might fear that he gives aid and comfort to whoever one takes the enemy to be. If you're an anti-Marxist, you might say, well, this guy's in league with the Marxists. If you're a Marxist, you might say, well, this guy's in league with the conservatives. So he once described himself as neither an adversary nor a partisan of Marxism. Perhaps that's the final word, because that was in 1984, just toward the end of his life. That self-description could be contested, but it's not wrong if it mainly means that he was willing to learn from Marx and to learn from Marxists. He was clearly an intellectual adversary, although not a personal enemy of Jean-Paul Sartre. I'll be regarding Foucault as a lifelong Marx avoider with respect to certain ethical issues. Now, I confess that my terminology is odd in the respect that Marx himself can be regarded as a Marx avoider if he's read in this way, because Marx himself made a great point that his case was not ethical. So if you're regarding ethical issues that Marx raised, well, Marx himself in certain way didn't want to raise them. And this is the whole sort of thesis of Louis Althusser, that the young Marx was not really a Marxist yet because he hadn't gotten beyond ethics. Althusser, by the way, was an important professor of Michel Foucault. So Foucault, on the whole, avoided the political commitments of Sartre, who Sartre was sort of the engagé intellectual of the time, and these were commitments that Foucault, on the whole, avoided and advocated avoiding. Although at the same time he was, in his own way, engagé with the prison rights movement, also with the anti-psychiatry movement. He'd done at least two social movements where he was an activist. In the last years of Sartre's life, the aging Sartre, leaning on the shoulder of Simone de Beauvoir, sometimes marched on the street together with Michel Foucault, demonstrating for the same worthy cause. But Sartre and Foucault were not engagés in the same way. Even they were at the same place at the same time, doing the same thing, their philosophies were different. Sartre was participating in a long-term global movement to change the system. Foucault was participating in a short-term specific action to resist power, or an effect of power. Okay, I'm going to start now, but I'm just going to begin, and then I'm going to stop for now to make a few remarks about the childhood of Foucault, and then just a little bit about beginning to talk about his first writings. Paul Michel Foucault, later known as Michel Foucault, was born on the 15th of October 1926 in the provincial city of Poitiers, being the second child of his parents, following his older sister Francine and preceding his younger brother Denis. The family is rich. A governess takes care of the children. A cook does the cooking. There's even a chauffeur. His father, Paul Foucault Sr., with whom he never had an affectionate relationship, is a surgeon and a teacher at a school of medicine. His mother, with whom he will spend the month of August until his dying days, inherited extensive real estate holdings in the region. Madame Foucault devotes herself to the education of young Paul Michel, even sometimes hiring private professors to supplement what the local lycée is able to offer. There was a time when she didn't really like the philosophy professor at the school. So she persuaded the school to fire him and hired another one at her own expense, who taught not only her own son Paul, but taught all of the children. When Foucault failed in his first attempt to pass the admission exams for the École Normale Supérieure, that's the great, the highest or most classic school of France, She sends him to Paris to prepare for the entrance examinations again, this time at the high prestige Lycée Henri IV. He doesn't get along with his classmates. He's different because he lives alone. The students at Henri IV, except for Paul Michel Foucault, are either external or internal. Those from Paris live with their families and they're external. Those from the provinces, like Foucault, live in a dormitory. But Paul Michel cannot stand to live with a group. And since his family has means, his mother tries to buy an apartment for him. She finds none for sale, and Paul Michel ends up taking a room in a house on Boulevard Raspail. Both in the Lycée and at the École Normale Supérieure, to which he's admitted on a second attempt, Foucault is seen by his classmates, here I'm quoting his biographer Eddie Bon, as wild, enigmatic, a loner, sarcastic, argumentative, aggressive, and half-crazy. He was almost unanimously detested, still quoting his biographers. In the 1940s, homosexuality was not as widely accepted as it is today, and young Paul Michel suffered greatly because of being gay and because of what appeared to be some form of insanity. More than once he attempted suicide. He read widely and passionately. He read Plato, Kant, Hegel, all the philosophical classics. He read the Marquis de Sade, Kafka, Genet, Faulkner, and vanguard literature generally. He read Freud and the other psychologists, and like everyone else, of course, he read Marx. But more than anyone else, he read Martin Heidegger. At a slightly later period, he read more Nietzsche than Heidegger. In an interview in 1984, Foucault said that reading Heidegger and reading Nietzsche were for him two fundamental this was a deathbed interview. In a deathbed interview in 1984, he said reading Heidegger and reading Nietzsche were two fundamental experiences for him. And I believe it. I think he's telling the pure truth. I think Heidegger and Nietzsche were two fundamental experiences for the young Foucault. First, he read the translation of Sein und Zeit into French, which appeared in 1942. And then he devoted himself to learning German. Why? Why did he want to learn German? To read Heidegger in the original. In 1948, he graduated with a degree in philosophy, writing a senior thesis on transcendental history in Hegel. In 1949, he graduated again, this time in psychology. In 1952, he finished earning a graduate level diploma in pathological psychology. Well, and he joined the Communist Party in 1950, and he left it in 1953. So that's enough for now on early Foucault, a little background, a little of his self-description, a sort of a beginning at trying to piece together his significance and why we're worried about him and about his influence.